The scientific revolution starts now.
The Mysticism podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
There are so many religions in the world that contradict one another. They can't all be right. And the most likely explanation is that one of them all of them possibly, are false. And yet, every culture seems to do this. Humans are prone to do this. We're almost compelled to believe in the mystical, the supernatural, life after death, omnipotent beings, the ancestors that we venerate who take care of our lives, and this, all this stuff that we believe in without any clear empirical evidence. So why is that? What is it about human nature that makes us religious? That's kind of the thing that got me thinking throughout my career about, why are we religious? Now, my career had nothing to do with religion. I went to Caltech for my undergraduate years, majored in biology, and I very quickly got interested in neurobiology and did some work in some neurobiology labs there. The brain was absolutely fascinating, and I was thrilled at the progress that was being made there. I did my PhD in neurosciences at UCSD in Ted Bullock's lab. And his lab is one of the pioneering labs in what's called neuroethology, which combines the ethological tradition of studying behavior, where you're mostly interested in natural behaviors that are easily understood in terms of the reproductive success of the animal. Ethologists tend to look at highly specialized animals that do one particular behavior really, really well, like the way barn owls hunt by sound cues, or the development of song learning in songbirds, using electric fields to find your way around in the water in the case of weakly electric fish. So the idea there is that understanding the brain is so difficult, it's so complex, that our best hope of making progress is to look at some system in the brain where we already understand the problem the brain is trying to solve. And that's the motivation for looking at these highly specialized animals. So that was my background, and nothing I did in my early years had, scientifically, nothing in my papers had anything to do with religion. And yet it was always in the back of my mind during this time. And I started listening to Christian radio in the lab when, working late at night doing experiments, partly for entertainment value. And there was a preacher on the radio that I was especially fond of, who used lots of infantile imagery in his preaching. He was always emphasizing this aspect that humans are helpless and childlike and utterly dependent on this nurturing, loving God. But he also preached a punishing, cruel, judgmental God. At the same time, he would alternate between the two. He mixed these two dimensions of God. So that stood out like a sore thumb to me. And of course, he was not the only preacher who does that. You can find those two dimensions of religion throughout, all religions, really. So that clued me into something and got me thinking about where religion comes from. And having this background in ethology, I started thinking, okay, if it has this infantile dimension to it, maybe it's something innate, and maybe it has something to do with what humans are specialized for. So, so that's kind of how I got into it. If there's any common theme to my career and work, it's evolution. That evolution is the thing that shapes the behaviors that ethologists are interested in. Evolution is the thing that sets the pattern, the order that's in the brain at the time an animal is born or hatches. And evolution, I think, is the best way to understand where religion really comes from.
So in that vision of humans as the specialized animal that develops religion, is the specialization storytelling and myth-making?
That's part of it. that's part of it. I would say that the specializations of humans that matter most as far as our religiousness are two things. One is our extreme degree of complexity of social behavior. We are arguably the most highly social animal on Earth. No other animal has what we have. No animal has taken over the planet the way we have, has complex language the way we do, writing, society, accumulated knowledge, cultural evolution, the scientific method, scientific technology. All of that comes from our highly social nature. Even our closest primate relatives don't come close to us in matching that. Although we can see rudiments of our sociality in them. So that's one thing we're really, really specialized for. The other thing is it's not so much that we're specialized to be helpless infants, but we are born as helpless infants. And I think part of the reason for that is that's an indirect consequence of our high intelligence and our high sociality, our language, the importance of language in our social behavior. All of those things take a long time to master through learning, through following the example of our parents. Language acquisition takes a year roughly or two just to get started. To be a master of a language takes many years. So we have this long childhood where we are utterly dependent on our parents for survival and our education and training. And we start out, as many other mammals do, as utterly helpless, completely unable to sustain ourselves, to feed ourselves. We absolutely depend on our parents, and in the first critical days, especially on our mothers for feeding and nurturance and warmth and all of that. So because of that, I argue that we are endowed at birth with an innate model of mother, that the brain is primed to expect the existence of this primordial savior that will connect with us and take care of us and feed us and protect us. And we as infants are primed to expect that and seek it out and connect with it.
And so then is the preacher on Christian radio who you're listening to, is he leveraging this innate desire for the universal mother and then bending people into submission with the bait and switch of how do I say this? Of appealing to this desire for parenting and for something that deals with how infantilized we can be in the world, and then is replacing it with a vision of something that's much more aggressive and much more dangerous? Is that kind of what you saw happening?
He's definitely appealing to both of those things, but I wouldn't say he's replacing one with the other. He's presenting that both of them simultaneously, even though they contradict one another, and people don't even notice the contradiction. There are, there's a verse in the Quran that goes something like, Allah is the merciful, ultimate, perfectly loving, merciful God who is the dispenser of painful punishment. So he's the benevolent, all merciful dispenser of painful punishment. In one sentence, you have these two absolutely contradictory images of God, and no Muslims that I know of complain about it. Nobody seems to notice the contradiction. And the reason I think that the faithful don't notice the contradiction is that those two dimensions of God come from two distinct intuitions that are very powerful in our minds. There are two unconscious sort of things we have, things our brain expects that operate at an unconscious level, and they're so powerful we don't even notice that they contradict one another. I haven't talked about where the judgmental, cruel God comes from, but that comes from, I think, and I'm not the first one to suggest this, This is actually what most of the scientific study of religion deals with, this judgmental, punishing, all-knowing God who's sort of watching out for every sin you commit and ready to punish you for it. The same God actually metes out rewards too, but the point is that he's omniscient, he's omnipotent, and judgmental. The thinking in the field is that this kind of image of God comes from that early development of our social behavior as hunter-gatherers, when cooperation within the in-group was extremely important, when people had to do things for the greater good of the entire tribe, even if it meant putting themselves in danger, like participating in a cooperative hunt of some large animal like a woolly mammoth or whatever. You need some way to keep track of who is cooperating and who is not. And the larger the group becomes, the harder it is to keep track of who is cooperating and who is cheating. You need not only to remember all these acts, individual acts of cooperation and generosity or cheating and stealing, you also have to associate them with each person in the group. And if there are so many people in the group, at some point, it just breaks down and you can't have this delayed reciprocal altruism, it's called. So it becomes easier to do that, however, if you have belief in a God who takes care of all that for you. If the God is omniscient and is seeing everything that everybody does, then all you need is for people to demonstrate through some means that they absolutely believe in this God. They don't just pretend to believe it, they really do believe it. And if they show loyalty to the gods, then you can trust them as cooperators. Now, to make that work, you need a religion where God demands costly, painful sacrifices as proof of loyalty or proof of belief. And that's where you get all of these rituals of painful sacrifice in religion, things like circumcision in Judaism and Christianity now, genital mutilation and hazing rituals. There's all kinds of stuff like that in extant hunter-gatherer tribes. And there's a lot of sacrifice in religions. You see it everywhere. So that's the idea. And that's what I call in my book the social root of religion. This idea that we believe in this powerful, fearsome, judgmental God to keep us in line as social animals in a group where we trust each other and cooperate. The infantile dimension of God, this God as perfectly loving, benevolent, unconditionally loving, that comes from what I call the neonatal root, which we were talking about earlier, where we start out having this innate neural model of a mother. And I argue that part of the brain that does that stays in the brain during adulthood in sort of a dormant state, but can be activated when the person is in some condition that is mimicking the helplessness of infancy. It can trigger this circuitry and create the illusion, the sensation that this being exists, and the feeling, the illusion of the sensation of the presence of this kind of loving, nurturing being, just when I'm at the depths of despair. So that's where I think these two dimensions of religion come from. And I think you can explain a lot of religiousness from these two interacting things.
It seems to me like the low-hanging fruit is that the monotheistic traditions have integrated the matriarchal and patriarchal aspects of parenting under one roof, essentially, at this point. Because if you look at the origin of, say, the Judeo-Christian tradition, the God of the Bible, let's say, was inherited from the Canaanite tradition predominantly, with, various stories mixed in from other local traditions. But that original God, the storm god, Yah, had a consort originally, right? Who was
Yes.
embodying all of the more matriarchal, I don't want to say feminine necessarily, but the motherly aspects, right? And
Yes.
I don't know about your upbringing, but I think we can probably all, those of us who were fortunate enough to have both parents in the house in our childhood, we all probably experienced this system and situation where the father was in some sense the enforcer of the house, right? Wait till your dad gets home, kind of thing. And
Yes.
the mother is, of course, this endless sea of love and caring and almost unconditional love, right? Like no matter what you do, it's like, oh, it's okay. Like you just messed up. Like you'll be all right. And so I see an integration of these two aspects in the monotheistic tradition, where it's not so much that there's a contradiction so much as there's two forms embodied inside of one. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with that very much. And one of the questions I most often get when I give a talk and describe this idea of the innate model of mother and the kind of sense of presence that comes from it, one of the questions I get is, okay, if that's right, then why is God male? And it's an easy question to ask in our culture because God is often typically seen as male in the what we call the both in Judaism and just about every flavor of Christianity. Jesus is male, his father is male, and so on, and that's God. Um, and my answer, of course, is that the maleness of God comes predominantly from this social root of religion, which we were talking about a minute ago. And like you say, that tends to be the way the division of labor happens in families. That the father is the authority the figure, the fearsome punisher, and so on. The mother tends to be more unconditionally loving. And I also, in discussing this with people, I point out that in other cultures, the religion is not so male dominated. And these two dimensions of religiousness, the neonatal and the social, they vary from one religion to another and from one culture to another. And for example, Hinduism, there are many female goddesses. They are, and they come in different flavors. You even have goddesses um, that are fearsome and punishing, as well as goddesses that are maternal and loving and nurturing. And in religions like Catholicism, which is a very patriarchal religion, where God is male and priests are male and women are not allowed to be priests, and the, the entire hierarchy of the church is male and male dominated.
And they
Even
even
there,
call the priest father, which is really
yes, you call the priest
significant.
father, exactly. Even in that case, the feminine side of God creeps in sort of surreptitiously by popular demand of the faithful who say prayers of intercession to the Virgin Mary, a motherly figure, an unconditionally loving motherly figure, who is in Catholicism pretty much elevated to the status of a goddess, although they seldom come right out and admit that. Also, you have the various Catholic saints, and hundreds of them, who are prayed to for various favors or specialties or whatever. The female uh, saints outnumber the male 2 to 1 in Catholicism.
Hmm.
So in those ways, the feminine side of God creeps into patriarchal religions, even if they try very hard to purge it.
So the masculine being this ordering phenomena, this ordering nature that's embedded within us, and the feminine being this loving impetus that's embedded within us. These religions emerge in order to account for the loss of that guidance as we emerge into the adult world and we leave behind our childhoods. Is that the basic idea here? That it's a structure that humans have adapted in order to let's say guide themselves into
to make
their
it more tolerable, right? It's a
yeah,
terribly painful
to
transition,
soothe, yeah.
right? I remember reading that times of great difficulty tend to make people much more religious. You know, if you have a famine, if you have a war, if you have a Great Depression, people
Yes.
suddenly need to have a story that they fit their experiences onto in order to make suffering through it bearable. And I
Yes.
think that this is a very Russian perspective, but I think that life is suffering. You know,
Sure.
it's a long, hard road, and you need something that makes it less.
Progressive suffering too, right? It's like there's new levels of suffering you achieve the further you get into life that you didn't even know were possible when you were a child,
Absolutely.
perhaps. I mean, if you're in the best case scenario, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of children undergo incredible suffering, but for the most part, you know, if you're lucky, you're introduced to new forms of suffering the older you get, essentially. You lose the people that you're most close to, that you form the longest bonds with.
Yeah, and it's like without a story of how that all fits together, it just seems like it would be unbearably painful.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's interesting that you brought that up. The myth of Genesis very much recounts what I think, my interpretation of it anyway, very much recounts what you've just been describing. It's that kind of story. It's Christians typically see in it the story of creation, and the evangelicals, the fundamentalists, take it as a literal historical account of creation. But I think they're missing the point. The myth of Genesis is to me a myth of coming of age. Um, when when Adam and Eve are first introduced as characters, they're like infants who are being nurtured in this plentiful Garden of Eden where all their needs are met. They don't have to do anything. It all just comes to them. And they're innocent and they walk around naked and don't care and don't think there's anything unusual about that and don't even notice it. And they are just having an idyllic existence in this paradise where all their needs are being met by a nurturing God. And then they break the rule and they start learning by eating of the tree of knowledge. The tree they ate from was the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and specifically knowledge of their own sexuality. After eating the fruit, they suddenly notice, oh, we're naked. We, we should be putting on clothes. And it was this reaching the stage where they become aware of their own sexuality that suddenly everything goes to hell. They're cast out, they're rejected by God, and they are condemned to a life of hard labor just to eke out enough of a food, scratch out enough of an existence from the ground, from farming, that they can just barely survive, and they have suffering, and women are now going to suffer when they give birth, and all of these hardships of adulthood come to them at this moment. So to me, it's a story of transition, of growing up, of reaching adolescence and early adulthood and realizing suddenly that life is short, difficult, and painful. And and that, I think, is the essence of the myth. And
It's
it probably is the case. Now, I don't know whether there was selective pressure for it. I think the selective pressure for the innate model of the mother is almost entirely, if not entirely, directed at those first few critical days when an infant is born and needs to make a connection with the mother. Um, we don't think about this very much, but in harsher times, in prehistory and during the hunter-gatherer existence, there were droughts and there were famines and there were hard times that we don't really experience very much anymore, where a mother who has a newborn has to make a very difficult decision. Do I keep this child and try to keep it alive? Or do I abandon it and keep my other children alive, where at least I have some hope of coming up with enough food to keep them alive? I might not be able to keep all of them alive if I have one more mouth to feed. Um, Infanticide was, something that has a biological necessity in some situations. We see it in lots of other animals that are in environments where they're in in drought conditions, famine conditions. They don't have enough resources to keep all of their offspring alive, and they will reject or abandon or kill some of their offspring. Some birds do this, for example, just to be sure they reproduce. And human mothers probably went through this kind of situation in our early prehistory, and it was in the infant's interest to show the mother that, yes, I'm vigorous, I'm alive, I'm energetic, I'm strong, I'm the kind of infant that can make it.
Mm.
And they do that by crying out, by making their presence known, by making a connection with the mother. So there's this very critical time for the infant's benefit. And I think that's where that's the main selective pressure for this innate model of the mother. But that was a long digression. But it may be the case that it also has some benefit later on in life, during these moments of personal crisis, to have this feeling that there is some benevolence to the universe, or some loving, invisible, all-powerful being out there that is protecting me and looking over me and can help me through this crisis.
Are you watching the Demystify Sci podcast and wondering, what can I do to support this absolutely incredible project? Well, wonder no more, because you can come on over to patreon.com/demystifysci and sign up to give us a couple dollars a month. Might not be a lot for you, but all of those donations add up, and they let us push this project to even greater heights.
It's an interesting thought.
I mean, I think that you're absolutely right that Genesis captures the arc of one's lifetime. But I think what makes it such a powerful and persistent story, like the reason that it's stuck around so long, is because, like all great poetry or mythology, it captures existence on so many different levels, because you have the story of the personal voyage through life, but you also have the story of I think that in some sense there's a real memory of humans actually becoming human for the first time, like generating that self, having language and being able to examine each other as other aspects of the same experience, seeing, well, I'm a person and you're a person, and oh no, like now we have conflicts because we have different needs. But you also have this civilization level story, because Genesis terminates in this flood story and this Tower of Babel story, which are very much teaching us about the arc of a civilization. I think there's an argument to be made that we're very much facing a flood right now with this climate change business, and we very much are facing a Tower of Babel situation with this, the rise of transhumanism and the techno-utopian promise of the future. And so there's so many. It's like the more you pick at that story, the more levels of meaning you can find within it. And I think because it has almost an unending set of rich layers, that it's able to persist over and over, because in some sense, like you said, that these fundamentalists, it is perplexing to me when I speak with fundamentalists that they try to take it as almost a scientific truth, as opposed to looking at it as this piece of multivalent poetry, right? Yeah. Poetry is not supposed to, we don't look to Shakespeare and try to understand anything particularly relevant about the science of the situation, like how the weather was back then or something like that. We're looking to it for layers of meaning. And
actually, I think some people do that.
They probably do, but there's going to be somebody who takes everything in the wrong direction. But it does strike me as a bit tragic that people would fixate on trying to extract something like material truth from it when it's offering a very different kind of truth.
I actually think that it goes even deeper than just this truth about, say, the Tower of Babel and the flood and the rise and fall of civilizations, because I think that human cognition and human ability to speak emerged linearly from something that preceded it. And I have a feeling that animals, in their own way, have a mythology. And if there was a mythology that animals have, from all of my time observing wild animals, it would be that there was once a garden that was plentiful, that was full of food, where you never had to work, and everything was there. And this idea of having children as being the thing that casts you out, right? Because it's awareness of your nudity is then inexorably linked to the fact that, well, what are you going to do with that nudity? You're going to have kids. And the kids are the thing that propagate forward eternally. It's the driving force of life that is universal from the very, very first cell that reproduced, that creates its own terror, which is that, well, now you have responsibilities. Now you have more mouths to feed. And now you cannot stop working because you will destroy something of yourself. And that must precede the human ability to say we have fallen from the garden or whatever. Like it's a deeper animalistic thing.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, eating from the tree of knowledge is so interesting to me when I think about what's unique about humans, which seems to me to be something like the ability to wield language in a way that allows us to envision the future and the past and integrate them into some plan of what to make of ourselves and what to make of our society, what to make of our civilization. And of course, with language comes the ability to lie and deceive and to come up with plans that are riddled with catastrophe and tragedy and genocide and God knows what else people have manifest on this planet through virtue of examining some ideal future that they hope to walk towards. And one thing we didn't mention too is that even that story is tempted to do that by some dark force, right? There's this hint of something evil that's made her do this, right? That's sort of cast her from this state of innocence.
I'm thinking of this painting that I've seen of this moment where God comes and is like, "What have you done?" And Adam is standing next to the tree, and Eve is like sitting next to him, and he's just like, and he's just like pointing down at her.
She
like,
did it.
Yeah, it wasn't me.
So this emerges for these mythologies emerge for good cause in order to guide people through this otherwise impenetrable chaos and suffering that perhaps would be there otherwise. I think you make a really good case for that in the book, in particularly just how we're set up to have that need from the moment that we're born. Now, let's talk about science, right? The emergence of science and sort of the rational turning away from religion since the Enlightenment, because I think an argument can be made that religion has never been less popular than it is today. And so the question naturally becomes, is that a good thing? And it seems like you answer that in the affirmative in your book, but you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I would say, especially you've kind of primed me for it in a way by talking about eating of the tree of knowledge. I don't try to argue that science is an unalloyed good, that everything we get from science is a good thing. You can also see you were talking about how Genesis ends in a flood story, and we're in a flood story of our own making now with global warming. We're in this fix with global warming largely because of the success of scientific technology of doing the things that we wanted it to do for us. Give us energy, give us mobility, transportation, all the things we do in the modern world, having conversations like this over the internet. All of this comes from scientific technology. All of it involves burning fossil fuels. All of it involves pollution that is causing us unforeseen, unpredicted problems. So now, you can say that eating of the tree of knowledge that could also be a metaphor for the way science has gone, that we've eaten of the tree of scientific knowledge now, and it has vastly improved, or increased at least, it increased our power to manipulate the environment. And we are learning, much to our dismay, that we can have side effects from that are potentially disastrous. And we're learning as we go, and we're making mistakes as we go. And science or the scientific technology, the way we use science, the things we apply it to, can sometimes be more destructive than helpful. Nuclear weapons is another example.
Just the obesity epidemic is the one that really just blows my mind. Just the fact that, 200 years ago, I think 90% of the population was just fixated on getting food for the day. And
Yeah.
today it's like far less than 10% of the population is concerned with these matters. But at the expense of the fact that now people, at least in the developed world, well, let's just talk about America. I mean, the fact that we have enough to eat is a problem at this point, right? It's so easy to get calories, right? But the nuance of where you're getting those calories is so complex that it's almost beyond most people to concern themselves with until it's too late. And that's just mind-bending to me, that by solving one problem, we've created a problem out of it that has the same identity with the original problem. The solution set has so much identity with the problem itself. It's just mind-bending.
Yeah, absolutely right. The one thing I try to emphasize in talking about the scientific worldview, the empirical worldview, is that it's the best mechanism we have for truth finding. We can have some confidence that the scientific method works because of the success of scientific technology, even if the success brings with it harmful side effects. Let's go back to nuclear weapons for a moment. Nuclear weapons, I think, were initially hailed as this wonderful breakthrough that brought World War II to a sudden end and saved, as it turns out, arguably, a great many Japanese as well as American lives by stopping the war suddenly before there was an invasion of the Japanese mainland. But then, of course, we had an arms race, and we've stockpiled nuclear weapons and put them on intercontinental ballistic missiles, and now we're at a position where we could destroy the world with them if things go wrong. And so all of that's true, but I would still use that as an example of the power of science as a truth-finding mechanism. The fact that nuclear weapons are as destructive as they are is proof that our understanding of nuclear physics is pretty close to reality. If it wasn't, if we were way off base in our understanding of the way nuclei are structured and how atoms split and how mass is converted to energy, if we were wrong about all of that, then there wouldn't be any nuclear weapons. They wouldn't work. So for both good and ill, science is the best method we have for discovering the truth about the way reality works. And it is up to us to try to use that knowledge wisely, but just as a means of discovering truth. It's a wonderful thing, and I think we're doing ourselves a disservice not to teach our children better how powerful science is as a truth-finding mechanism.
I mean, I have a couple thoughts about that. One is that in some sense, we owe the high value of truth to these religious traditions in the first place, because, right out of the gate in Genesis, the idea that truth is important becomes central and that deception isn't somehow evil. And so the fact that our civilization is even oriented towards truth in the first place is established in these religious traditions. But my other thought is just that science undoubtedly has improved our material circumstances, and it absolutely leads to a kind of truth regarding material reality. And if you look for that kind of material truth in religion, you come up with all sorts of contradictions, right? You mentioned them at the beginning. All the religions conflict with one another. Even individual lines and stories within one tradition can conflict. But I would argue that there's a different kind of truth available there, which is more in the poetic tradition of truth. It's more in the artistic tradition of truth. It's the truth that you discover that you just talked about. Well, we have all of this knowledge of how the world works. We need to be wise about how we handle it. And I don't know that science is cut out to the task of determining this experiential truth, this wisdom of how we should behave. What do we value? going forward, other than the pursuit of truth itself. It's like I had a friend one time that was, being kind of cruel towards someone, and I sort of reprimanded him for it, and he said, "Well, what I'm saying is true." And I'm like, "Well, it's also true that you're being an asshole right now." Right?
Yeah.
And so truth in and of itself doesn't seem to necessarily have this supreme value outside of being contextualized within some wisdom of how to behave. And I see that the mythological poetic tradition, which in its substructure gives us religious tradition, it offers something that perhaps science is not capable of.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. I guess I have a few thoughts on that. One is that science has not only given us the gasoline engine and cars and jet planes and all the things that are making global warming now, but it's also given us climatology and chemistry and physical oceanography and all the things that pointed out to us this side effect of global warming and the catastrophe that looms because of it. So it's both caused the problem and it's alerted us to the dangers of the problem. But science also can explore human morality, the questions you were just getting at. What do we value? What constitutes being an asshole? How should we treat one another as individuals and as a society? How should we organize ourselves? How should we govern ourselves? What kind of government works best for human flourishing? There are some ways that science, I think, can help with those questions too. That psychologists like, for example, Jonathan Haidt has some interesting ideas about innate moral intuitions. There, he gives evidence that humans have these innate moral intuitions about right and wrong that are pretty much cultural universals. They get shaped differently in different cultures. Some aspects of them get emphasized more than others. Some cultures are emphasize cruelty as a sport, like ancient Rome. Others emphasize compassion and kindness more. But science can at least explore these dimensions, and we can, I think, get some help from science from that. But those intuitions, what the gut feelings about what's right and wrong, the feelings that make you cringe when you see a parent excessively punishing a little toddler, those are kind of built into us, and we don't get them from learning. We don't get them from science. They're just part of us.
Do you have something else, Tia? I can keep going if you.
No, go ahead. I do.
I mean, one thing that I'm afraid of is that you've made this great case that there's something biologically that demands this religious approach to the cosmos, and my fear is that when you try to take that away from people, that they will manifest it in newfound ways, in the form of deifying individuals, particularly even scientists, right? Einstein, his pictures on the wall of most science classrooms that I've been in, from school-age kids. But we think about other characters, Adam Smith or even Stalin and Mao, right? These are deified individuals that kind of became so in the a structure that tried to abolish that religious form, that religious substructure to civilization. And it worries me because I see that in some sense, the polarization in our society is people acting out in order to express values by deifying new natural phenomena in a way that tries to replace that. But I'm not sure that that's particularly healthy. What would you say to that?
Well, I'm glad you brought up that subject because it's something that it's on my mind a lot over the last few years. there's a big difference between Einstein and Stalin. Einstein is respected and admired among scientists mainly because of his discoveries. And his discoveries stand independently of the person of Einstein. And if you look into Einstein's intimate biography, which I've only dabbled in a little bit, what I picked up from watching some documentaries, he apparently had a lover that he wasn't very good to, that he was an irresponsible person early in his life, in his personal relationships, let's just put it that way, and not at all exemplary in every human respect. So, but his discoveries of relativity and of our understanding of the way gravity works and of the way space-time works, those things stand independently of him, and they are a scientific triumph, and those are the things that matter most about Einstein. We often hear from creationists various criticisms of Charles Darwin, that there is, well, Darwin said this, Darwin said he believed in a creator in this quote here, so, obviously evolution is wrong, or some argument like that. Nobody cares what Darwin says in particulars like that. Evolution doesn't stand on Darwin. Evolution stands on evidence. Everything in science stands on empirical evidence from nature, not on the person who said it. So we admire and venerate some scientists because of what they discovered, but that's kind of where it ends. However, humans do have this strong tendency to deify other humans, as you said, and there's a certain personality type that just seems to be irresistible in that way. Psychiatrists call it narcissistic personality disorder. That's the kind of person who is bombastic, charismatic, confident, very self-assured in his outward appearance, but also very domineering, selfish, self-centered, attention-seeking, haughty, prone to pathological lying, prone to exaggerate his own or her own accomplishments. That kind of person attracts a following. Some people are just drawn to that like a moth to a flame. And we see that now most dramatically in the person of Donald Trump in this country. Psychiatrists will tell you he's the poster child for narcissistic personality disorder. He checks all the boxes. But he has this following that is astonishing and absolutely bewildering to a great many people. They just don't understand what's going on. Just recently, John Kelly was one of the people. He was Trump's first, what do you call it? His first assistant, his first chief, whatever. One of Trump's advisors early in his presidency. John Kelly came out and said, "I cannot understand why people still want this man to be president after all that he has said, after all that he has done, after this insurrection, this attempted coup, denying the outcome of the election and trying to subvert it. He's recorded on tape doing these things. He's been now indicted in several jurisdictions over it. How can people still want him to be president?" And I would argue that it's this cult phenomenon, that it's something that's in human nature, not just that this kind of personality is part of human nature, this narcissistic personality, but the desire to follow that kind of personality is something that's intrinsic to human nature, and that is the core of the cult phenomenon, the cult leader. What Trumpism is, in essence, is a cult, and cult leaders are seen both as this judgmental, punishing, fearsome figure, authoritarian figure, and also as an unconditionally loving parent. That's the astonishing thing. The followers of Trumpism see Donald Trump both as a fearsome, punishing, godlike figure and as a nurturing, parental, loving figure. He's the one who is going to save all of the innocent children who have been kidnapped and abused and murdered by the blood-drinking, sex-crazed, sinister cabal. This is the QAnon myth. Donald Trump is the one who's going to save those children from the evil, sinister cabal of child molesters. It's both, and these are the same two dimensions we see in religion, and Trump is sort of replacing their cruel and unconditionally loving God.
I think people are really tuned into that truthfulness too, and not in the scientific sense, but in the poetic sense, because there's something about Trump that strikes them as very genuine, right? He's very off the cuff. He just seems like a real person to his followers in a way that these other, let's say the opposition seems like a production, like a committee more, like something that's just put on, and they don't feel like they're connecting with a real human being in those cases. And I feel like that's where he wins so much power over his opposition.
And it strikes me that in the absence of a strong central belief system, that what you are going to get is lots and lots of cults. Because people don't get rid of this need to have something to have faith in. They need figures, they need heroes. Like, it's very hard to write a movie or a story where there isn't just one character that is the central arc around which everything revolves. We seem to have this fundamental need for it. And so, obviously, organized religion is as much about state crafting and power as it is about offering some kind of set of beliefs that you should have faith in. And it seems like when you step away from a central organizing principle, there's no other outcome than to have people come together in search of this canonical hero that they can organize around that represents things that they think are necessary and good in the world.
Yes. There's something comforting, too, about having an authority figure, a parental authority figure, tell you what to do. It simplifies your life. And it's I think partly a desire to return to that idyllic childlike state where you didn't have to make decisions, you didn't have to worry about the consequences of your actions so much. You just had to do what you were told, and somebody else took care of deciding what it is you should be doing. And I think that's part of the appeal of this authoritarian cult figure, that it feels like belonging to a family. It feels like being a child again. It feels like mommy and daddy are back and embodied in this one person. I think that's part of the appeal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I guess the question just becomes like, is it a reasonable expectation that you can remove that need that people have? And if you try to replace it with science, won't science also just become a cult that becomes dominated by personalities? And, you say that Einstein is venerated and so forth, but I think it's more than that. I think he's really been deified at this point. I mean, there's good reason to believe that, at least at cosmic scales, that Einstein's theories kind of fall apart to some extent. There's all sorts of, but it's very difficult to challenge those ideas because no one is smarter than Einstein. And at some point, these personalities, when they become deified and carved in stone, they're very difficult to displace. And I worry about the Nobel Prize along these same lines. It's like, how do you make progress in a domain by which you have given an almost benighted ceremony by a king that's said, okay, this is the truth, and we've decided it, and it's done with. Well, what happens if we made a mistake, as we often do in science, and we have to rethink things? It's very difficult to move past those. So I just worry that science is inadequate to accomplish that role, and that people will make it happen regardless of whether they have an underlying unified religious structure or not.
So if I can add something to that, I don't think that science is incapable of searching for truth. It's just that we have a tendency to want to say, this is the last ground truth that we will ever need. And that's the thing about religion or belief that works, because if we accept that religious ideas, religious mythologies are somehow reflective of deeper mythological truths, right? So let's say that there's two categories of truth. There's mythological truth about, if you do bad things will happen to you, if only because you will corrupt your relationships to the people that you were closest to, and they will turn their back on you and they will throw you out of their society. Like,
And
that,
mythological truth is multivalent, right? There's all these different levels you can punch down through, whereas scientific truth is like very specific. It's like this law says this will happen in this case all the time.
and so I wonder what is going to happen to us as we begin to replace religion with science, because you see people all the time being like, I believe in science. And what they believe in is not that our science is going to be continuously updated and that we will see a paradigm shift within our lifetimes that completely overturns the beliefs that we have about some system right now, in the same way, in the same way that the Copernican revolution overturned our understanding of the cosmos. That's not what they believe in. They believe in the fact that this final iteration is the correct iteration. And that's really alarming, because it seems like science isn't built to carry the weight of that kind of belief, but it is being stress tested right now because that's what people want from it. In the absence of God, they're like, okay, that stuff, the organized religion is necessarily worth walking away from, but we have this deep-seated need, therefore we must turn it to something, therefore we turn it to science. Science we believe in, science is the ground truth. And that's wild, because, like, what if we're wrong about fundamental stories about the universe and we have no way of recovering?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It triggers a few associations for me. One of them is a great talk given by Neil deGrasse Tyson some years ago, where he was talking about Isaac Newton's religious beliefs and where he saw God in the universe. And Isaac Newton, of course, was absolutely brilliant, arguably the most brilliant physicist we have yet produced ever. Some physicists will easily put him on top. He invented calculus. He discovered the laws of motion. He formulated them mathematically, the law of universal gravitation, worked out the orbital dynamics of the moon around the Earth, a whole bunch of stuff that was just stunning for how far ahead of his time he was. And yet, when he was working on the mathematics of the motion of the planets around the sun, he came to the conclusion that it was just far too complex for it to have happened by accident, that there are too many there are too many ways that it could go wrong, that it could become unstable, that gravitational interactions between two planets would throw one of them out. And, how could this possibly work just like clockwork the way it does? And it was at that point that he said, this order, this perfection, this synchrony of the motion of the planets could only have come from the mind of God, or something like that. And Neil's point about this was that when Newton made the step of just throwing up his hands and saying, I can't figure this out, therefore God did it, he in effect stopped his own curiosity. He stopped his inquiry. He gave up and just passed it off to divine intervention. Even though if he had not done that, Neil deGrasse Tyson feels anyway, Newton had all of the smarts and intellectual power to solve the problem mathematically, which ultimately was done a century later, roughly, by Laplace, or sometime later, using perturbation theory. So, so yes, the religiousness of an individual scientist can have a stunting effect, sort of like what you were just talking about. But it's important to make the distinction between that and science as a whole, science as a collection of individual scientists interacting in a social way, a social organization, where even though some individual scientists may get stuck on a pet theory that turns out to be wrong, and they're so stuck on it that they never abandon it, and their research kind of grinds to a halt, and they go off on a dead end and never get anywhere, the rest of science moves on around them and progresses anyway. In the case of Einstein, for example, Einstein did not like the probabilistic nature of quantum mechanics. And he famously said, God does not play dice. It just did not appeal to him in some emotional way. He just could not believe the universe worked like that. And so he made no progress in that direction. And the rest of quantum mechanics developed around him and moved on past him. And it's seen as a failing of a scientific failing of Einstein, that he did have that attitude, that he let his emotional intuitions cloud his scientific judgment that much. So the rest of quantum physics doesn't really see Einstein as a god, and there's no danger, I think, that they ever will for that reason. If there are people who are doing what you suggested, who are trying to deify science as it is now, and therefore blind themselves to the progress we will make by overthrowing current ideas that are wrong or incomplete, then that's just an indictment of how poorly we're teaching science, because science is fundamentally a method. Science is a way of discovering truth, and truth is always with a small t, not a capital T. We're always thinking of truth as tentative and subject to rejection and revising pending new evidence to the contrary.
It's interesting that you bring up quantum mechanics and the diversion or the bifurcation from, let's say, Einstein to the quantum world, and how he spent his life kind of alarmed at the direction in which science was going. Because it seems to me that what happened with quantum physics is a jump from a world that made sense to a world that didn't. And it was a world that is discussed in physics in a language that most people don't understand.
Yeah.
And so you have widespread acknowledgement that no one understands quantum mechanics, right? This is I think it was Feynman who said that. And then there was a really interesting editorial a couple years ago in the New York Times by, I think it was Brian Greene, who was like, hey, not only does no one understand quantum mechanics, like nobody's trying to anymore. We have math, the math works to some superbly precise degree, but we don't understand why the math works. And so what seems to be happening is almost a transition towards a more liturgical science, right? You said that when you were young, you'd go to Catholic church and Mass was in Latin. And it was okay because people went, and it was the pomp and the circumstance of the guy in the robes. And I've never been to a Catholic church, but I think that there's like censors that there's, it's a production, it's an experience.
Yes.
Pope lives in a fancy house. You can look at him and be like, well, that must be meaningful. And it doesn't matter that you don't understand what's being presented to you, because you were able to go into this house and say, I believe in the structure. The specifics, less important. And I worry that by virtue of physics having become so mathematical, with the underlying principle that, don't worry, you're not meant to understand this, that we're going down a very, very religious road with physics because it depends upon belief, where it's like someone can point to the math and say, look, the math holds. And you're like, yeah, but what does the math mean? And they're like, that's a stupid question. You're not meant to understand that. No one understands that. And I'm like, that's a weird foundation for our central value in society, right? Because I'm a biologist by training. But at the end of the day, all of science, when you dig down deep enough and you get to like the very, very specific questions that you're asking inside of biology, you cannot help but come up against physics. Like I studied the electron transport chain in bacterial metabolism for my PhD. There is no way to not come up against quantum physics when you're doing that, because you're looking at these proteins, and these proteins have these reaction centers, and the reaction centers are separated by some distance, and yet electrons are flowing through them. And you're like, well, what does that mean? And they're like, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what that means. Like the physicists have it. And you're like, okay, well, what do the physicists have to say about it? And they're like, well, we have equations that tell you how it works. And you're like, but I'm a biologist. I study the substance of life. What is the substantive explanation for how this actually works? And there's not really one. There's math. And you're like, but the math isn't how it works, or what is happening. The math is just a description of your tools that are being used to measure some outcome. And so you end up at the very, very foundation of the sciences with this deeply nebulous, unsubstantiated foundation where you're looking for something that you can fit together as bodies impinging on one another that explains to you how the electron transport chain really works. But you can't get there because the tools that would get you there end at the mathematics.
Which is basically Latin.
And suggests that we live in a world that isn't actually real. Like, have you considered the implications of that? Like, so quantum field theory is our universally accepted foundation for physics. Everything is made of the excitations of fields. And when you're like, okay, well, what is a field? And they're like, well, a field is a sea of changing vector quantities. And you're like, well, that sounds like that's a measurement of something. And they're like, no, that is the thing in and of itself. And if that's the thing in and of itself, then what are we doing except for living inside of a computer? Because that's what a computer would do. Like if you were inside of a computer and you were like, well, what is the base of this computer program? It would be an algorithm. It would be a quantum field. And so it seems like our modern science has led us away from this Newtonian concept. Like the Newton story is crazy because Newton comes after Descartes. And Descartes was there was like a 50-year period after Aristotelian metaphysics dies. Descartes is like, I think that everything is matter in motion, and I think it's these little vortices, and I think that everything moves because of the interactions of the vortices. And he tries to explain everything with vortices, and then Newton comes in and is like, that's garbage, the math of that doesn't work out, and he derives in the Principia all of the reasons why the math doesn't work out. And then he gets to the end and he's like, but I have no idea why it works. In fact, it is not the job of the experimental philosopher to figure out how it works. And it sets us down this path where we're, 400 years later, and we still don't know how it works. And nobody's even looking because the math is so good, the Latin is so good, that we're all like, the scriptures say so, and it's fine, and it's good.
Well, you triggered a few more associations.
Good.
First of all, I have to voice a disclaimer. I'm not a physicist either by training. I did take some physics courses in my undergrad years. I have some clue about what quantum mechanics is about. I'm not an expert. And I asked my physics teacher, his name was Goodstein, at Caltech. One time he was visiting our dorm and having a dinner with us and just chatting. And I asked him, basically if he understood this duality of waves and particles that is at the core of quantum mechanics. And he said no, and nobody does really. But I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't go so far as to say, and Goodstein didn't, that nobody understands the mathematics. The mathematics is, as I'm sure you know, a description of the wave function that describes the behavior of these subatomic particles that turned out not to be Newtonian in their behavior. And their behavior was so strange, the more we probed the behavior of electrons, say, the less they seemed like Newtonian balls moving around according to Newtonian laws of motion. And you could get them to interfere with one another in the way light waves interfere, which is a wave-like property, not a particle-like property. So that's the kind of thing that is mystifying, that people have a hard time wrapping their minds around. It only happens in the realm of very, very small things, subatomic things. Or occasionally you can see quantum mechanical effects at a macroscopic scale at very cold temperatures, when you're dealing with liquid helium or something like that. It will do strange things like flow over the side of the beaker and onto the table just because it's doing a quantum mechanical thing that won't happen to liquids at normal temperatures. So it defies intuition. It defies human intuition. And in that sense, nobody understands quantum mechanics. It's something our brains are not adapted to cope with, because quantum mechanical effects don't happen at the scales we're used to living at and seeing and interacting with the world. It's only when you start using instruments that can probe the behavior of electrons that are subatomic particles that you start to see them, and suddenly you realize, wow, that's different. I wasn't expecting that. And the mathematics that describes this, the way, there's the Schrodinger equation is the thing that describes the behavior of the wave function, and Goodstein said, so where does the Schrodinger equation come from? Or somebody asked him once, where does that Schrodinger equation come from? As if there's some physical thing you could sink your teeth into that gave rise to it. And he said it came from the head of Erwin Schrodinger, and we put up a slide showing Schrodinger's face. That's where it came from. It came from a human mind. It happens to work. It just happens to describe this paradoxical behavior, wave-like behavior. You have this strange wave function, which in itself almost doesn't have any physical meaning. But the square of the wave function gives you the probability of finding the particle at any point in space. But the wave function does have some kind of physical existence, because that's what gives you, it's the wave function that gives you the interference behavior, where the two-slit experiment, you probably know, and some of our listeners probably know, you can pass electrons at this barrier that has two little slits in it, and they come out in a way that doesn't look like you would expect if they were just particles going through two slits. They come out in this wavy pattern that's the kind of thing you would expect if there were two light beams going through those little slits. So the Schrodinger equation gives you all of that. All of that falls out of that, and the mathematics of quantum mechanics is highly predictive of a whole host of esoteric behaviors of matter and energy at these scales. So in a sense, people do understand the mathematics, but they don't really they can't really give you something to sink your teeth into about this duality of particle and wave, and what exactly this wave function is, and we don't have a good answer to that. That in my mind is the stuff that nobody seems to understand about quantum mechanics. To my way of thinking, it does not mean that our universe is unreal, or that we're a computer simulation. I can't completely dismiss such an idea, but I have no way of testing it. So put it aside with all the other untestable ideas for the time being, and concentrate on the things that can be tested.
Well, that's a really healthy mindset. I appreciate that. And I think that if we were to look at these paradoxical behaviors and say, hey, we don't understand this, but we should, and we should put some effort into understanding it, and that should be a very hot topic of inquiry, that would be really healthy. There's wealth of history and in science for paradoxes appearing and then having actual explanations that seemed beyond what did you say, beyond our human ability to comprehend. Like heat is a great example. Heat was very much presumed to be a particle, just like the electron, just like the photon, but things didn't add up with that model. It seemed like you could generate essentially limitless quantities of this fluid through friction, and this just didn't make sense. And it took somebody making the leap to, hey, wait, I think heat isn't a particle. It isn't a fluid. It's just the motion of some materials. It's actually the molecules and atoms moving in a new way that moved us through that paradox. And it was the hope that we would be able to do that allowed that progress to happen. And so what worries me, and I think the tragedy of Einstein is that, Einstein also thought, hey, there should be a solution. We don't have it yet. And his, colleagues at the time were kind of like, no, the solution is that it is a paradox, and that's fine, and we're going to keep going. And of course, the math is perfectly sufficient to develop technologies on the back of it, and you can move past understanding the fundamental reality and develop amazing technologies or terrifying technologies, as it were. But I worry that if, in so much as we have faith in that reality is paradoxical and that's the bedrock of it, that this really gets in the way. This is a Newtonian shoulder shrugging of, well, we don't worry about those kind of things. That's not our job. That seems to have religious undertones. It seems to be a faith-based assessment of the situation.
That's unique to physics in a weird way. I always think about this. I'm like, okay, imagine that neuroscience worked this way, where we just had mathematical models for how the brain worked, but we were like, there's no cells down there. Like we can attach electrodes to the brain and we can see the waves, and we have a mathematical model for what happens when the brain goes, and that's enough. We don't need to know about the cells. We don't need to know about what's generating the things that we're detecting. Like that wouldn't be that would be an absolutely absurd science to be in. There would be,
and yet it would be highly predictive and highly accurate, and you could stand behind it and say, no, it works.
Yeah, but it would be full of paradoxes. It would be full of strangenesses that were absolutely undiscoverable, unsolvable in the absence of a physical model. But you're like, well, hold on a second. The reason that this behaves so strangely is because you have these multiple I don't know enough about neuroscience, but you have these multiple areas of the brain that there's actually cells. There's such a thing as an action potential. There's such a thing as inhibition. There's such a thing as activation. And there's these physical things that are relating to one another. Like without that, what would you have? You would have, you would basically just have a purely mathematical discipline that, like Shiloh said, is like highly predictive, but not really about anything.
Yeah. And there's no danger, though, that if the Society for Neuroscience, published something saying, okay, this is what we're going to do from now on. We're just not going to bother with all those cells. We're just going to concentrate on brain waves. And that's all we need, really. There would be some graduate student somewhere who would say, nope, I'm going to take apart this rat brain and I'm going to put a little electrode in it. I'm going to see what's happening in there. There would somebody would just ignore that and go off and explore and dig and say, I want to see what's in the brain. I want to look at the cells. I want to, put them in a blender and separate them on a gel and find out what the molecules are. I want to look at the genetics. I want to study the ion channels and all that stuff. And somebody somewhere would come up with great discoveries doing that, and the Society of Neuroscience would tear up their position paper and say, yep, he's right. that's really where we're going. That's where the discoveries are now. That's what's interesting. Let's go that way for a while. And of course, the Society for Neuroscience doesn't do that. No, there is no authority in science. That's what makes science work so well. Science is this social kind of thing, the social phenomenon, where it's the discoveries that are most fruitful, the way of thinking, the models, the hypotheses, the experiments, the place that's paying off the most in terms of new discoveries, and what I really mean is the most powerfully predictive discoveries, the ones that are best at making predictions that can be tested. And when you do the test, you say, oh, wow, that worked. This guy was right, or at least he's closer to right than I was. I'm going to do experiments and follow his ideas for a while. That's how science progresses. That's how we make breakthroughs. And that's, I think, what safeguards us from the dangers of deifying science in some way. There's always going to be some iconoclast who will break with whatever kind of dogmatic thing is stultifying science at the time. I mean, that does happen. You do have ideas in science that take hold because there is a lot of evidence for them. There's a lot of evidence for Newtonian mechanics, for example, and we use it a lot for the realm where it applies, even to this day. But there is always going to be somebody, some whippersnapper, who comes up with a breakthrough and shows everyone else that, okay, yes, what we had was an approximation, and what he's showing us is that there are places where it doesn't apply, and let's go there and see what's there. Science just does that naturally, and it's a wonderful thing to see, and that's what gives it its power as a truth-finding mechanism.
And I believe that whippersnapper will appear to give material form to the quantum equations, for sure. I think that will happen, but I think that person will have a really hard row to hoe, because I think that there's something fundamental about humanity that embraces the spookiness and the mysticism of quantum mechanics, because it fills in that need that we started this conversation with for something beyond us, which is unknowable and in some sense omniscient, and doesn't make, it can't be understood in our everyday reality. And I think that that's going to be a really, no matter how compelling their theory that gives form to those equations is, they're going to have a heck of a time getting that past the wider public, not just the scientists, but certainly them too, who really fundamentally believe the world is this kind of mystical, at its fundamental base, is this paradoxical, unknowable, mystical place. And that need for humans to have that, it just seems like it's going to be really, really difficult to displace.
Because there's something that you said about neuroscience where you're like, well, look, there's going to be a grad student that takes a brain and throws it in a blender and figures out that there's actually something there. And that's true. And I think that that's actually the reason that biology didn't remain mathematical, because it's relatively easy to see stuff, right? You have a microscope, you put some onion root tip cells under it, and oh my goodness, you can see chromosomes. There's something down there. Let's go explore it. Because biology tried to be statistical. There's this guy Pearson, I think Carl Pearson, who was the founder of
the p-test.
Yeah, he invented all of the statistical tests that we use today. But he was a staunch advocate around t-test and p-value, chi-squared, like all these things. He was a hugely loud advocate for the idea that all of biology could be statistical, that it was totally fine, that we could just deal with the mathematics of how populations behaved and the mathematics of what we were observing. And he was around the same time as Mendel, and so Mendel was doing his experiments with the peas, and Mendel was like, no, I think that there's something down there. And it was because all of the technology had arisen to the point that anybody could take a microscope and look and see that there was something down there, that Pearson didn't get his way. He was also a eugenicist, which is like always a difficult thing to surmount in terms of getting your ideas accepted. But you can't do the same thing with physics. You can't build a particle accelerator in your house. Like, you can't do the experiments of putting the proton in a blender and running it out on a gel the way that you
Yeah.
can with rat brains.
Yeah, it seems like the final step in physics is not more data. There's plenty of data. Like, we've characterized these wave particle systems to the moon and back. It's really an interpretive level. It's really somebody coming along and saying, this is what this is actually describing, the behavior of these materials in this motion, the same way that they solved the heat paradox. But I just can't imagine the difficulty of trying to propose some solution that eradicated this supernatural realm of the quantum universe that people just love, especially with the decline of religion. It gives them that sense of awe, and I just worry that we can't actually extinguish that religious need from ourselves, and it can get in the way of science itself.
Yeah, it's possible. And I know what you just said reminded me of a couple of things. One TV program I follow fairly closely is, I don't know if you've ever seen it, Closer to Truth. Robert Lawrence Kuhn. He's a neuroscientist by training. He's a little older than I am. He's intrigued by the deep questions, the big questions, and a lot of them are, in my mind anyway, and his too, I'm pretty sure, unanswerable questions, at least at present. Things like, what is the most fundamental level of existence? What is there? What is the bedrock of existence? Is it particles? Is it, quantum mechanical wave functions? Is it consciousness? That there are some people who say that consciousness is the fundamental thing, because we haven't yet come up with a good explanation in terms of neurons and so on of what consciousness is and how it arises and how it gives rise to all the subtleties of conscious experience. So he's interested in that kind of stuff, and he goes around interviewing scientists of all stripes, some brilliant and distinguished, a few off on the fringe. He was just recently talking to Deepak Chopra in an episode I was watching about this subject of consciousness being fundamental. Deepak Chopra is a physician, I think, by training, but he's a guru in effect. He's some might call him a cult leader. He's made a fortune by doing some kind of self-help stuff, and has a following and center of meditation and all this. And he publishes books about how quantum mechanics proves that reality isn't real or something like that. He's trying to couple Eastern mysticism with quantum mechanical strangeness. So you're quite right. There are people who do it, and it seems to be an irresistible draw for some people. But I think the most I don't think there's any danger, though, that most of science will be derailed by that. There will always be enough clever new young scientists with new ways of thinking and new approaches that we'll get around the Deepak Chopras of the world.
I appreciate that. I definitely tend to agree. I see a very, very difficult battle for that person. Those people who want to look at that in a different way. I think that they're fighting not only against the weight of science, but they're fighting against that mystical need, this deep biological need that you've outlined in this book. Those innovators are going to be fighting against the weight of that entire burden, which has been offloaded onto science from religion in the absence of, in the wake of rational uprising and this faith in the rational tradition and reason and empiricism and so forth, because those physicists can always say, hey, this is very predictive, this is absolutely, these mystical interpretations are congruent with these predictions, and it's like, good luck arguing with that. It's going to be difficult no matter how nice your model is. Hey folks, first Demystify Sci live event is happening this year in Austin, Texas on April 7th and 8th. Please come out, hang out, meet us, meet other curious investigator audience members. You can also hang out with our invited speakers that are going to be there, including Pierre-Marie Robitaille, who's going to be speaking about the liquid metal sun and ushering us through the eclipse. Also a number of different speakers from the University of Texas, Austin. It's going to be freaking incredible. I want to see you there. So grab your ticket and I'll see you there.
I think we can close out the direction of this conversation to ask if you think it's possible to get rid of the human love of mysticism.
That sounds like a good way to go, good direction to go. Yeah, so I guess my short answer is probably no. I think it will always be with us in some way, in at least some fraction of the population, that we have this innate longing for attachment to some nurturing figure, some figure more powerful than we are. I think that's just something deep in human nature, and there will always be some people who express that, who seek it in ways that we would identify as religiousness or mysticism. And what I think is more realistic to hope for is that will happen in a sufficiently small fraction of the population that they don't dominate society and lead us astray in a dangerous way. We have in the past had religious thinking of a kind lead societies terribly astray. And we were just talking about Donald Trump and authoritarianism and cultishness and stuff like that. His hold over his followers is, I would describe as kind of a mysticism. There's a mysticism about Donald Trump in their minds, that there's an attachment to him that has the same religious quality to it, that even though and it's no accident, I think, that the people most drawn to someone like Donald Trump are evangelical Christians. That it's a largely religious thing. Trumpism is, and same in other authoritarian forms of government, where you have someone like Stalin or Hitler who is deified by their most devout followers. So that's the worst that can happen. But if it's a sufficiently small fraction of the population, then that's something that can be tolerated, and we can avoid the catastrophic misdirections that can happen with that kind of a leader.
Is there something? Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that it's important if we're going to strive for that. It's important that we do a much better job of teaching science to our children, especially maybe at high school level, than we're doing right now. I know far too many people who don't have a clue as to what science really is. That science is a method for discovering truth about how reality works. There are people who I talk to, some of my Trumpist friends. In fact, I've just on Facebook, I asked them, how do you decide what's true? Why do you refuse to? I've tried to urge them to see some of the hearings of the committee on the January 6th attack, and they just refuse. They won't even look at it. So I asked them, how do you decide what's true? And basically what they tell me is that truth is a matter of opinion, that everybody gets to decide what's true for them, and that's the way it should be. And if people think that, if they have no distinction between opinion and fact, no distinction between objective reality and what we wish to be true, then we're doing a terrible job of teaching our children science. So anyway, I'm maybe going a little off topic here, but um, I just think it's really essential that we teach our children well about how science works and what it is.
And that it's a living discipline, right? I think that's at the key
Yes.
of that's at the heart of this. I'm actually trying to submit one of the courses that I teach right now for the general education requirements. I'm trying to make this case why a normal student who's maybe a business major should have any business taking a science course. And it comes down to really understanding what science is, because I think most people, the danger, like we've explored extensively in this podcast already, is that we get locked into one way of thinking. And and I think that is in some sense the danger that you're rebelling against in religion too, is that we get locked into one way of thinking.
Yeah.
And in so much as science is absolutely a method for discovering truths about reality, so is mythology, right? Especially progressive mythology that's able to adapt to the civilization as it progresses and as the humans evolve, right? But when we get rooted in these old ways of thinking, we decide that's the final T on the truth, that's when we run into catastrophe, as far as I can tell, in both religion and science. They seem to both suffer that potential pitfall.
I think it's really, 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 really hard to teach science well. Like, I teach microbiology at the university, and it occurs to me that we're not really teaching them science. And then I spent a lot of time thinking about my own experiences coming up through the ranks of becoming, biology PhD. And when you get to grad school, you're definitely researching and you're trying to figure out some aspect of life. But basically, for the 12 to 16 years before that, what you're doing is you're learning facts. And you read a textbook, and the textbook has the things in it that you have to memorize. And you have to memorize it in order to be able to be a scientist. And so by the time that you get out of undergrad, you've maybe done some labs in the sciences, but they're not really labs where you're trying to discover anything. They're not even oftentimes labs where they're recapitulations of old experiments that somebody did, where you then have to derive the old relationships that, say, Newton derived for a pendulum or something. Like, it's taught in a way where you're going through these rutted roads that
Yeah.
somebody has gone a million times before. The person who's made the lab has used it for the last 15 years. It's the exact same. It's never changed. And I'm just struck by the immense difficulty of what a true scientific education would look like, because I'm like, science is basically somebody being locked in a room for years, maybe decades, with a fanatical interest in some fields where they just become so obsessed with understanding it that they are able to read widely enough on enough subjects that they can, in their mind, hold the massive mystery of life for long enough to be able to see some imperfection in the parchment in order to be able to say, I think that I think that that's wrong, and I think that I can figure it out. But we don't teach science that way. We teach science as a done deal. We teach it as,
Yeah.
just memorize this list of facts. These are the factors that are involved in transcription, translation, post-processing.
Which leads to the calcification and this belief, the ism of it, right? The belief that it is the final word. That's I suppose the full danger.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I've often thought that I'm not a teacher, so I don't claim to have the answer to your question, but I've often thought that maybe it would be good to try to teach science to, say, grade school kids, middle school kids, and high school even, um, in a very experimental way, emphasize the empirical nature of it, maybe in a contrived way where you present puzzles, artificial puzzles maybe, that a person has to solve, but they're puzzles that are amenable to trial and error exploration. And I'm not sure exactly, I haven't given it a whole lot of thought. It's kind of an half gelled idea, but there should be a way where you could give somebody some kind of puzzle to solve, a playful thing, but, a Chinese puzzle with many pieces that have to be taken apart and put back together, something like that, where, but designed in such a way where um, you can get to the solution by trial and error, by experimentation, by just trying things and seeing what helps and what doesn't. Maybe electrical circuits, getting motors to work with batteries, or I don't know what, but something that
Something about the
where
spirit of play, right? It seems
yes, exactly.
that's a really
Make it a
critical
playful
word.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because I know even by the time most people get to their PhD, they're sort of thrown onto whatever project has funding at that time, and they'll, best case scenario, they have some spare time. They'll stay in the lab late at night and they can play with some idea that's occurring to them. Maybe it's not funded, maybe it's not part of their dissertation, but they can play with it. And
yeah,
and there isn't a very institutionalized way of integrating that spirit of play, which ultimately leads to discovery, like you say.
yeah.
And I'm
The-
always searching for ways in which we can do that in our, because we both teach at the university, and I really want to find new ways to encourage that spirit, because I think that's what leads to the de-stagnation of ideologies and dogmas in science just as much as in any other domain.
So,
Yeah.
unpopular opinion, but what if not everyone can really learn science? Just in the
Well-
sense that, look, everything that I have read about the history of science and the history of philosophy and the way that it moves and the way that it works is that it works by virtue of a specific kind of mind. And I don't think that we have a uniformity of minds.
Yeah,
And so I often think about this idea of, we should just teach everyone to be able to think in the ways that scientists think. And I wonder if that's even possible, because there's just a certain type of turn that you need to have in order to be able to do the kind of empirical, logical reasoning that is necessary for science. Like, I think that maybe a humanities corollary would be to teach people law, like 2 tracks, like a humanities track where people can figure, because I feel like law is very similar to science in the sense that you have to gather your evidence, you have to put together a case, you have to think about the way that these pieces fit together. And
The
so
LSATs are basically a logic test.
yeah, and
Yes.
so maybe the real foundation is less about science and more about logical thinking, where, there's many different paths. There's forensics, there's law, and then there's science. And so as having those 3 tracks running in parallel where kids filter based off of their interests, because not
You
everybody
left out mythology, though.
yeah, like how do you, because I never
Is there a role for mythology in your future, ideal future?
Yeah, I would think so. I wrote a blog post some time ago about it was a. I'm not much of a blogger. I've only written a few things on my website, but one of them is something I wrote for the 50th anniversary of the Apollo moon landings back in 2019, and it was a. We've actually talked a little bit about it already. It's partly my personal history growing up and my interest in space exploration when I was a kid, and my own coming of age story, which just happened to coincide with the moon landing of Apollo 11. And there was there's a quote that I used from Salman Rushdie about mythology. As I used it as an epigraph for that piece. I wish I could give it to you word for word, but I won't do it justice. But basically, he said that if you look at a dead religion, like say the Greek mythology today, the Greek, what we now call Greek mythology, used to be the Greek religion, and people really believed it, and they actually prayed to these gods, and they had, rituals and sacrifices and inquisitions and all these things that go with a religion. It was a real live religion to them. But he said that eventually religions tend to die off, and when they do, then you can appreciate the religion in a more beautiful way as story, just as myth. Then you get from it deep insights about human nature.
Mhm.
And the point that I was trying to make in my little blog post was there had been a lot of objection from the atheist community, or some anyway, objection to the Christmas message from Apollo 8 when it was orbiting the moon in December of 1968. And they read from the book of Genesis, the opening passages from the book of Genesis on Christmas Eve. And some atheists got, upset about that, saying that, oh, this is mixing religion and these are government workers, and this was a moment shared by all people on earth, and how could you spoil it by putting one piece from one religious tradition in it? But I argued that they were missing the forest for the trees, that I thought it was a perfect choice. Because if you take Genesis, as I do, as a story of coming of age, and that we humans were coming of age in something like the Apollo missions. We were stepping off of Earth, our first tentative steps into space. It was science that got us to the moon, not the god Apollo. Apollo had once been a god, but now Apollo was a product of mathematics and chemistry and physics and the human mind and human creativity and human drive. And it was a beautiful accomplishment. And
And all of those things, by the way, are the spirit of Apollo, which is, somewhat ironic.
yes. And for me, it was you could sort of see it as the adolescence of humanity, that we're no longer dependent on the gods to get us to the moon. We can do it ourselves, and we will do it ourselves, and we now have done it ourselves. And to cite or to quote or to read from the myth of Genesis was just perfect in that way, because of its being a myth of coming of age, in my interpretation anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I feel like the superficial reading of these religious texts as, accurate, let's say almost scientific accounts of some business that transpired, they're so superficial. It's such a pedantic reading of it. It's such an infantile appraisement of something that it's tragic. Like, some of the most tragic interactions I have are with hardcore fundamentalist, literalist people, because I just feel like it's so sad that they're missing out on the richness of analogy and metaphor and the layers of meaning that can be applied to, like you said, everything from our own story throughout the world to our civilization to the evolution of humans from apes. I mean, there's so much rich meaning there, and none of it's accessible if you stop at the words on the page. It's such a tragic oversight. And so, yeah, I would hope that, and by the way, it's so significant that NASA still names their craft after these mythological entities, right? We can't let go of it. There's something deeply important about that the Greeks understood. Whether the general populace started celebrating the superstition over the actual meaning of the stories, I'm sure that happened just like it's happened today. But NASA, right, these scientists, these very objective, reasonable, rational people, they still honor that tradition. I mean, the names of the planets, the names of the asteroids, the moons, they all trace back to these stories. And it can't be accidental, whether it's subconscious or not. It seems like we do want to celebrate that way of looking at the world still in our scientific endeavors.
Yeah, I agree.
Nasia looks like she has something to say.
It's cooking. I guess I see myth and mathematics as being deeply rooted together, because the birth of mathematics seems like it comes from as early as we have civilizational myths. And if you look at the earliest mathematics, they dig up these clay tablets from Sumeria. And what they have on them is they have engineering relationships. They're like, this is how you calculate angles. This is how you calculate the length of a triangle. This is how you look at the stars. This is how you keep track of things. And so the Greeks did this really interesting thing where they mixed mathematics and mythology. The Pythagoreans had this tremulous reverence for the symmetry of numbers, for the shapes that they made, the way that they related to one another. And that must be significant because it feels like the emergence of a new kind of quantitative mythology that has taken thousands of years to really become as powerful as it is today. But what we have now is still an abiding mythology of numbers. Like we were talking about the strangenesses of quantum physics, and that to me feels very mythological. You see people who are theoretical physicists, and what they obsess over is the beauty of their equations, the beauty of the symmetries, the transformations, the mystical way in which these things relate to one another, and the mystery of forces. And to me, it seems like we still live in the time of, I mean, it strikes me as Pythagorean mysticism sometimes. Like we have fewer, we don't have rules about how scientists shouldn't eat beans or poke fire with swords, but we do have this sense of the beauty of numbers and the significance of them. And I think that this leads us into what Shiloh wanted to talk about, which is this idea of the technological future that we're building on the back of the mathematics, because what we're doing is we're headed away from the mechanical machine age and into the age of algorithmic consciousness. And what we seek in that emergence is we seek the emergence of a new consciousness, a new intelligence. And what people are afraid of with AGI is that we're going to create this super intelligence that's going to be a new consciousness that surpasses and eclipses the ability of humans, and then we become the plaything in the lap of an ambivalent, intelligent God that we have created. And that also seems like we have plenty of myths that tell us about the dangers of that. But I don't know how much time we spend interpreting those myths, because there is a desire to move away from them. We don't want to be religiously preoccupied anymore, and so the stories are just stories. And you had something you wanted to say about the Tower of Babel.
Well, I think the techno-futurist dream can be viewed in light of the Tower of Babel, but perhaps a more interesting take on it is kind of the Milton mythology of this spirit that's trying to elevate itself above God, let's say, above natural consequence and so forth, that ultimately fails. And there's a warning there, and we see it appear in lots of different traditions associated with the planet Venus. Usually, this attempt to shine brighter than the other stars, and then being cast down into the underworld as Venus becomes goes out of view for a few days, and then rises again. And there's this resurrection myth that comes out of it. And
can I add something here?
I'm sorry?
Can I add something here?
Yeah, please do.
So I grew up in a really atheistic household. Soviet Jews in name only. We didn't have any rituals. We lit candles occasionally for...
Thanks, Stalin, for that.
What's that?
You can thank Stalin for that.
Exactly. And I, for a long time, was staunchly atheistic because I looked at the world and I was like, the stories they don't make any sense in terms of a reasonable and rational brain. And then I started thinking about the idea of God in context of consequence, where I think that there are consequences for actions, and there are consequences that are spiritual, where, you can lie about something and there's not any immediate backlash against that.
In the short term.
In the short term, but what you've done is you've poisoned the well that you drink from, because people will now know that you're a liar, and they'll treat you differently on the virtue of that. And so it seems like there are consequences for actions that are not material. They're kind of in the relationship between things. You know, you mine enough stuff out of the earth and it seems like you have abundant resources, and then you realize that, by God, what have we done? And there's the new chaos of the new age and all of the devilish things that come with it. And I just wonder if there isn't a powerful role for the idea of God as the consequences of the universe coming to bear on the decisions that we have made. Where it's not a personified God, it's not a God that comes from the religious books, but it's this idea that we cannot escape the final ledger for our actions as people, as species, as a planet, as beings that want to become interplanetary. Like, we need to have a deep understanding of spiritual consequences for actions that we take. And I wonder where one derives that from in a religious in an a-religious context. Yeah, in the absence of religion.
Well, you've just reminded me of my discussion in my last chapter of The Illusion of God's Presence, where I don't know if this is quite apropos to the point you were just making, but your thoughts sent me there anyway. My last chapter is about what do we do if we get to the point where maybe we were religious and we suddenly conclude, no, that can't be right. There is no God. So then what? How do I deal with reality now that this thing that used to be such a big part of my life is gone? What do I do with that? Where that leads me ultimately is to what we've done with our world through technology, through pollution and so on, all of the side effects that have turned out to be harmful, and the problem of just too many people being on Earth, of the population being now just recently hit the 8 billion mark. So so what should we do? How do we as a species deal with this? And my conclusion is that it would be best if we could somehow get our population growth under control, and that we make as our goal living in harmony with the natural world, getting into an equilibrium with nature. And it may be that we can't. I don't know, but that's sort of the note on which I end the book. That we're right now headed towards a very dark time ecologically. We may or may not get through it, but if we do, I'm hoping, as some of my scientist friends have said, that having been through that dark place, we will resolve never to let the Earth go to hell again. We will do whatever it takes to protect the resources that we have on this small planet, because that's really where the action is. We probably never will be a multi-planet species. Earth is our home, and we have to take care of it. Not sure if that's what you were getting at, but
do you have children, by the way?
I do not.
I see.
And my wife and I thought about it at one point. We decided against it for not just for that reason I just gave, but for several personal ones too. But I don't, and I realized that there's I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with having children, but I think we should all be aware of what we're doing when we bring more people into the world, and that the moderation in all things, and family size is one of the things where we should have some moderation.
Yeah, because one thing that really troubles me when I usually hear that argument about overpopulation is that it's like, who's gonna stop having children? Because oftentimes it's not the same people that are advocating that. They imagine somebody else will stop having children, but they'll continue to have children. And I don't know, it gets into a really creepy, like, eugenic territory at some points with these overpopulation arguments that I'm very, very nervous about.
Yeah, I do not. I didn't mean to suggest that we should have, an authoritarian government that institutes a one-child policy, as has recently been done in China. I would ideally, I think our ideal society would be one in which everybody gets to flourish at a nice standard of living. Everybody gets a good education, and specifically that women get empowered. Empowerment of women seems to be the thing that helps developing nations get their population growth under control. If it's women who are making the decision as to how many children to have, and they have some means of controlling their own bodies to make that happen, then it just sort of happens naturally. There's no need for the authoritarian dictator to institute the one-child policy.
Which, by the way, seems like it's been a disaster for China in recent, right? Their population is not growing at the scale that they would like it to.
I think that any kind of top-down decision about how you're going to deal with human nature that comes either from a state or from a religion tends to be a disaster. Like any time that somebody decides that they're going to build an ideology on the basis of changing human nature, it's like, well, that never works out. I less than the disaster of not being able to have children, I wonder about the disaster of us never becoming an interplanetary species. And I think that we have good evidence to think that the cosmos is pretty empty. Like, there might be other creatures out there, we can't detect them. The cosmos is big, so it's very possible that it's just a question of, time windows and the cycles by which we can detect something that's happening versus not. But I think about everything that has happened here on Earth, the miracle of evolution, the diversity of species, the beauty of all of the trees and the little creatures and the bacteria and everything. We lived in the Pacific Northwest, we still do. And one of my favorite hikes that we ever did was we went to the caldera of Mount St. Helens.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what I was expecting, right? Because you wander around the woods near Mount St. Helens and it's really verdant and mossy and it's the Pacific Northwest cloud forest. But then you get to the caldera and it is a raw wound on the landscape. It is absolutely dead. Not a single thing is growing. It is just broken rock with this seething waterfall that's coming out of the glacier that's still forming in the caldera. And it strikes me that is the end of the Earth. That is where the Earth heads if we don't leave. The sun sterilizes it, everything dies, and it returns to just this empty rock flying through an empty cosmos. And I think about what we would lose, just the evolutionary development. And I feel a strong sense that it is our greatest responsibility to leave this place and to carry with us the seeds of everything that has been made here in order to make it not be this meaningless blip in the darkness of space.
And to negotiate leaving it without leaving it behind, right?
Yeah.
Because that's often, I hear arguments all the time, from my students in particular, when we talk about colonization of other planets, let's say, that, shouldn't we be taking care of Earth first? And I don't think that it needs to be an either-or situation. I think both projects go hand in hand.
Yeah, because I'm like, I think that there is, what is life? I know that that's a big question. Do you have a definition for life that isn't just like a set of characteristics?
Yeah, I sort of do. Mine is a little different than the textbook definition. There's a textbook definition, one I'm sure you're familiar with it. sets out all the list. It has to do not only with reproduction, but metabolism and stuff like that, energy consumption, that kind of thing. For me, life is life on, let's be specific to life on Earth, the only life we know of. Life is the product of Darwinian evolution. And when Darwinian evolution started on Earth, that is when life started. And we don't yet know exactly where and when and how that started, but I strongly suspect it started in something that would not be recognized as life by the textbook definition. It would be something acellular, precellular, much simpler, molecular. And we don't know in what conditions it was, but there was some form of molecular evolution that started where information could be accumulated and copies could be made of molecules or chains of molecules, and somehow this Darwinian evolutionary dynamic would happen where you start this algorithm, get it started, and no matter how crude it was at the beginning, once you have that evolution, once you have that algorithm started, you cannot stop the emergence of greater complexity, greater sophistication, greater fidelity of replication, greater accuracy, and greater rate of reproduction. All this stuff just happens naturally once the algorithm gets started. So whatever it was that was reproducing when that algorithm started on Earth, I would call life.
It's really interesting to me how that algorithm is generally viewed in terms of selection, but most people don't realize Darwin also mentioned dozens of times in his book that there's this other force that's driving things, which is the struggle to exist, like the will for things to actually survive, not just the selective pressure by itself. And that's a really interesting thing to contemplate in the context of prebiotic entities, you know, observing the initiation of that struggle to persist. That's almost gets us into a supernatural realm, as far as I can tell.
That's the thing. Like, I agree with you that it's this algorithmic beginning, right? It's molecular of some kind. We tend to view life as being the cell, but there must be something that begins prior to the emergence of the cell that then comes together to make cells which are successful, which then carry on. And it's like the thing that appears to run through all of life is what Shiloh was saying. It's will. And it is the will to survive and the will to make more of yourself. And if will is the thing that animates the algorithm, and you can talk to panpsychists and like people like Philip Goff and even to some degree Michael Levin, who's doing the work about the two-headed flatworms, it seems like what they're all circling around is this idea that there is a desire for reactions to occur in a specific way. And that is particular to life. Like in a rock, we call it thermodynamics. In life, it has some other component to it, which is active, and so we can call it will. And it seems like the sum total of the will is to
exist.
To exist. And if the planet is to die, like if you are an octopus and you lay your eggs and you die after you lay them, you must lay the eggs in order to make more octopuses. And if we know that the planet is going to die, is not the greatest driver of life, is not the foundational force that pushes us to make sure that we survive the death of the tree that sprouted us?
Interesting. You know, I have a few thoughts on that. One of them is from Murray Goodman. Sorry, not Murray Goodman. Bruce Murray, confusing him with a different Murray. Bruce Murray from Caltech. He was a geologist at Caltech. He's one of the founders of the Planetary Society. He gave a talk on this subject many years ago at a Planetary Society meeting that I went to, and he was then talking about overpopulation and our pollution and how we're damaging the earth and heading towards what he thought would be a very dark time when our ecosystem could collapse to the point that it leads to human extinction. And his point was basically the one I just echoed a while ago, that if we get through that, then we will resolve never to let the earth go to hell again. That was the most optimistic he could be. He was actually it was a very pessimistic outlook on the future of humanity. He didn't think it would, he thought there was a good chance we would not get through this ecological catastrophe. But he also said that he felt that getting to another planet and, colonizing Mars or whatever wasn't the answer, that he didn't see that as feasible. He felt that Earth is our home, Earth is where the action is, this is where we're going to live out our life as a species. And he's aware, of course, of all of the great complexities and difficulties of truly making Mars into, or any other planet for that matter, into something where Earth life could flourish. We have very specific conditions here on our planet that our life is adapted to. And finding those conditions somewhere else is going to be really, really hard. Making them happen by terraforming is going to be really, really hard. In his mind, impossible, impractical. Forget it. We should be putting our efforts into taking care of the earth. Now, when you look ahead to some multiple billions of years in the future, you are quite right. The earth is going to be incinerated by the expanding sun, and all life on earth will vanish. So should we try to do anything about that? Should we start planning for that? Should we make ourselves a multi-planet species to prevent that? Goodness gracious. I think there are so many ways we could go extinct before then that I just consider that a very low priority of things to worry about.
And yet it seems inescapable that it is some sort of priority. Like, it's hard to view the space program as anything other than that at its fundamental base. It's like, whether people realize it or not, it seems like that's the project that we're pursuing. And if we do make it to another Earth, I mean, my God, like the last 10 years, we've been able to see Earth-like planets that aren't really that far away. And it's like, if 10,000 years from now, we end up making it to one of those planets and able to establish a new base for ourselves, I'm sure that in retrospect, we will view these days as the foundations of that project. And so whether or not it seems feasible, it seems like we're acting as if it is. Mm-hmm. We're putting our money where our heart is, at least.
And to go back to this myth of Genesis, it seems like the idea of the garden is also a story of human migrations, where you grow up in a place that is good because the people who came before you have nurtured it and they have made a garden.
Yeah.
And something forces you out to go into the world that is filled with other hominids that you have to then fight with, and there's monsters, and nobody's planted a garden yet, and there's no fruit trees, and you have to figure out how the hell you're gonna make teosinte into maize. Like, that's a story that is as old as the species, this radiating story. And I think that the way that we have gone about it is it's just really devastating, because you look at the things that humans have done to each other and what they've done in service of prophets and service of glory for kings and the commissioner of armies, and it strikes terror into the heart of anyone who contemplates it for long enough, because it seems like this inescapable force of human nature to just tear things up as you go, and to do it in terrible ways. But I wonder if this isn't a necessary mythology for the future, because we have to have something that isn't death and darkness and despair.
Yeah.
Because that's the current mythology of a dark time is coming and there's nothing that will get us out of it. And I'm like, okay, well, if we know that a dark time is coming, and it seems likely that it is, then isn't our responsibility to start figuring out what we're going to do to get out of that dark time and through it, and understanding ecology and understanding sustainability well enough to be able to take that and to make it so that it can survive in other places.
Yeah.
To me, I think seems like the highest possible calling,
Yeah.
because
I
it's
agree.
taking everything that's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It certainly, that's what it's going to take for us to survive on Earth. And we have to, I think, learn to survive on Earth, learn to live in a sustainable way on Earth before we can hope to live on on a sustainable way on another planet.
Mhm.
If we are ever to accomplish that, if we are ever to live on another planet, we will need to take with us enough of Earth, enough of the web of life, enough of the bacteria, the fungi, the insects, the plants, everything. We depend on all of it, but we could probably get by with a subset of it. But we need to know what the sort of minimal subset is, and we have to be able to bring that and live in a way that doesn't destroy it, doesn't wreck it. Right now, we're not living in that way right here on Earth. We're living in an unsustainable way, and there will be bad consequences from what we're doing if we just continue business as usual. So yeah, I agree that that's job one. Learn to live sustainably here on Earth first. Then at least we have a hope of surviving long enough that we could develop the technology to go to another planet. Probably would have to be in another stellar system. But speaking of which, there's the closest one, Proxima Centauri, is a red dwarf star. That at least is one that we don't need to worry about, you know, blowing up and incinerating the planets around it. They're very stable stars. They last for trillions of years, the astrophysicists say. So we could find a home there, and it's only 4 light years away, next door neighbor. With current technology, it would take tens of thousands of years to get there in a spacecraft. But seems like a daunting challenge, and with the planets we find there may not be suitable. But if there's any hope, we have to live sustainably here on Earth first.
And I feel like we've just reimagined the flood myth the flood myth and the ark and the story of Genesis in a modern context.
Yeah.
Like there's something to be when I try to evaluate these religious ideas where I'm asking, like, is this useful really? Like, would it be useful for me to believe this story as true, not in the scientific sense, but as something that is the necessary path for humanity? And it seems like, again, I arrive at, well, it'd probably be better if I did treat it that way, whether or not it's true or not. If I believe that it is, it's like, well, things will probably work out better for me in the end.
Because you can't really reach that through science. Like, I think that it's something that sits next to it. Science is what tells you how you will do it. It will tell you what bacteria are necessary in what relationships.
Which animals to put on the ark.
Yeah, but the drive to do that, the desire to believe that, that humans are worthy of even saving in the first place.
That there's a cosmic purpose for our existence.
Yeah, like I think that we live really purposeless lives right now, and everybody is lost in this morass of consumerism and buying stuff and working these email jobs that they hate, and they go through the motions and they soothe themselves by going shopping or whatever, or by drinking too much or by eating too much. And it's just, I see it as a product of the loss of meaning, because if you're God's chosen people, that's meaningful. But as you become more and more rational, you can't see it that way. And so you have to find a way to take those old myths and cast them into something that gives purpose without the burden of all of the state crafting and warmongering that came with putting the Pope in his fancy house.
And superstition, right? Just undigestible contradiction.
Yeah, like I think about this actually a lot, because I was looking at this immersion of like why, because the ancient Greeks had an idea of the atom. Like Democritus wrote about this maybe 50 years before Aristotle.
In a poem.
But we don't know. We don't have it.
Mm.
But probably. They all did. The really famous atomic poem is Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, which was written later during the Roman times, I think. And it was actually only like rediscovered in the 1300s, like it was lost. And so a lot of the modern Enlightenment came because they rediscovered it. The church had thought enough that people could actually criticize Aristotle. But we lost the connection to the sense of how the universe worked because the church came up. Like, there's no other way to explain it, right? So, yes, you can point to the fact that Aristotle, he was Alexander the Great's tutor, and he was Plato's student, and he was deeply linked to Pythagorean mysticism. And so all of these ideas were part of this religious continuum, like you said, where it came from a very, very real Greek religion. But there's somebody who was walking around who's like, no, things are made of atoms, and we can figure this out. And that was lost, and the time that it took for that to be lost was, I think, the 300 years between the start of our Gregorian calendar and the time where the Holy Roman Empire declared the Catholic Church, as the official state religion. Like, that was the moment where everything closed down and it stopped being possible to consider other alternatives to how the world worked. And it seems like there is always a moment where mythology and stories are functional for people to soothe them, and then they get taken over by an institution whose goal is state crafting and rule-making and power and expansion. And I feel like we are living right now in a moment where it's possible, where we're in that glorious interim, where there's no new religion that has yet calcified around the ideas of what the role of humans is in the technological future. And we have the ability to rethink what the institutions could look like that take over. And it seems like it's our role to imagine a value system that runs alongside of science, that is as deeply mythological and meaningful as the old ones, that will somehow be able to not be corrupted by the forces that will inevitably rise in another couple of generations to squash all of the ideas and to instead use it as a cudgel to do something that it wants to do.
Mhm. Yeah, that's profound. I don't know what that is, but it's fascinating even to contemplate it.
I think that it is this idea of sustainability and interconnection. I think that it's
Mhm.
this idea of us as being of the earth rather than the earth being. It was Francis Bacon said that it was our job to take nature by the forelock. Like, that idea has been central to science for the last
Yeah.
500 years.
Yeah.
And so we have the opportunity now to take all of that and to reimagine it through the light of, like, we need the mythology of what the role of humans is.
Because we need the scientists to be acting in their best possible capacity, which is in the best interests of humanity and the harmony of our ecological circumstances. There's this really incredible address that actually Ayn Rand gave to the MIT class back in the 60s, where she's essentially scorning them for having been essentially defanged of any moral philosophy in the pursuit of their understanding of nature. And it kind of harkens back to this William James sense of pragmatism. Like, well, wait, just because we can do something, should we? Like, what are we guided by? And I see the role of mythology in the future and in the modern sense, ideally, as being able to discuss those principles that should guide us in our decision making, that the basic technical art of science is incapable of integrating, at least in the general grander sense.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, so sustainability seems to be the single most important guiding light for our future. I think. I think you're onto something there. I think that's whether and how you need a belief system, a mythological system, a literature around that. That's that's maybe beyond my pay grade, but but I certainly as a scientist, I think that this is going to, if we are entering this deep time, this ecological crunch, this dark time, this threatening time when it looks like our own extinction is a real possibility, soon an imminent one. We're going to need as a society to put that first and foremost. That above and beyond our petty political struggles, of which nation should be the one that conquers the world, which economic system should be the best, whatever. Just living in harmony and in stable equilibrium with nature. That's what we should be striving for. That's the paramount goal. And that's, to me, what gives my life meaning anyway. I'm a nature lover too. I love hiking.
Yeah.
And I think we do see it. I think it is appearing. It's in the movies, and it's in the music, and it's in the arts. It's alive. That mythology is very much alive. All the scientists I've ever worked with have a deep appreciation for the arts and love of story and music and poetry. And I think that by the time that the body of wisdom that's contained in all of our arts has been condensed into something institutional like the Bible, it's probably too late. It's like it's already then being controlled by somebody who's curating that knowledge base, and it has a different purpose all of a sudden. But I don't think that it will ever be gotten rid of, because I think that mythology surfaces whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we've been at this for almost 3 hours. There's many places that we could go from here about, what it looks like to build an institution that's able to withstand this kind of force, but perhaps we can...
Yeah, we got to check out your sequel too, so maybe we can catch up with you down the road.
I'd love to have another chat with you. I've enjoyed this one immensely. It's been a lot of fun. I never thought we would be talking about, inhabiting other planets and saving humanity 5 billion years from now. So
Noah's Ark.
It's been fun.
We're gonna be in San Diego in like a month. If you wanted to get coffee, we could get together. Continue it offline.
Send me an email and we can make some plans. We could definitely do that.
That'd be fantastic.
All right. Well, thank you for giving us your morning. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it too.